The Walls in the Middle of Idumea, A Forest at the Edge Prequel. Written by Trish Mercer. Published by Trish Mercer. Read by Trish Mercer. And now a note from the author, and I'm not going to say my name again. Okay, so people have asked me when in the series is a good time to read this book. I'm reading it after I have just finished completing book 2. I think that's a good spot for it because you get to hear Perrin and Mahrree discussing what was actually going on with Grandfather Pere and the servants of Coral. And he gets, Perrin gets a few of the details wrong because he was 12 years old when he heard the story and he only heard it once. So he can be forgiven if a couple of things are out of place. Another good spot to listen to this or to read this, whichever the case may be, would be after book 4, where there are some fun little revelations at the end of book 4 about some of these characters that we encounter. But if you want to be a complete rebel and read the prequel before you read any of the other series and the other books in the series, go right ahead. I'm never going to tell you what you should or shouldn't do. Now, you may lose a little bit of context because this is assuming that you know some of the characters, but it's also the shortest book I've written, and so that makes it a little less intimidating for some people who don't really want to dive into a big, deep read without, first testing the waters a little bit. So you may absolutely just read this at any old time that you feel like it. I'm putting it after book 2, but hey, my friend, make your decisions. So here we go, without further ado. The first day of the week. The most important thing to remember was to keep the wood boxes full because that kept the war away. And in the largest mansion in the world, there are dozens and dozens of boxes to fill. Except that Fangy, the boy whose job it was to fill the boxes, didn't know what dozens meant. But he knew the path he had to take each day. Right after breakfast, he'd bundle up in his coat and gloves if it was the raining season and cold outside. But if it was planting or harvest, he'd head out into the gardens in shirt sleeves, but still with boots on, always boots. Boots were proper and expected in the mansion of the king. The family said the gardens were immense, but since Fangy had never lived anywhere else, or ever saw anywhere else, he didn't know how true that was. He could run to one end of the gardens in the amount of time it took to sing his favorite song in his head, plus another line. He'd be panting really hard, and the mansion would look smaller when he reached the farthest stone wall which surrounded the grand house and the gardens. Usually someone would be chuckling as he ran, then telling him to skitter back to where it was safer. He wasn't allowed to be near the tall stone walls. On the other side was danger, the biggest danger, the scariest danger. There were only 2 gates in the stone walls, guarded by men in dark blue uniforms on the outside, wearing swords and long knives. They never looked at Fangy because they didn't know he was on the inside. In fact, it was only last week that Fangy discovered that the men in uniforms were outside. The gates were always closed tight. Made of many layers of wood boards, the gates were as thick as Fangy's body, and so heavy that it took 3 men to push them open. And they opened only when horses pulling heavy carts came through with sacks of supplies and more wood for the boxes. Fangy was usually safely away in the mansion when that happened, and the wagons always came at night when no one could see them entering. But last week, there were mistakes. Last week, Fangy had again raced to the back wall and was talking to old Gramps, who was inspecting the corn stalks, now taller than Fangy, when they both heard the loud creaking. "Oh, no, you're not supposed to be here," old Gramps told him anxiously. "And the wagon is coming at the wrong time. None of us are to be seen. Your mother will trim my beard if she thinks someone saw you." Old Gramps, while not the oldest in the family, was very proud of his impressive beard. His pale skin blended so well with his white hair that it was sometimes difficult to tell where his face ended. Fortunately, it took much effort to swing open the heavy gates, giving Fangy and old Gramps time to hide between the rows of corn. The mansion grew nearly all of its own food on the farm, but Fangy knew that some things came from the outside, like sugar and flour. Where the outside was, Fangy didn't know, nor did old Gramps. While the world remained in an endless war, there still seemed to be some safe pockets where farming and occasionally peace occurred and continued. And because the king of the world lived in the mansion, he could always get sugar and flour, unlike everyone else. They crouched, trembling in the cornstalks. No wagons were allowed to come in during the daylight hours. Didn't they know that? That's when Fengi first saw the men in blue uniforms, pushing open the gates. They were big and strong, and probably not very smart if they were letting in a wagon. This was dangerous. Auntie Martha, one of the mansion cooks, had been in the middle of the tomato patches harvesting the reddest ones when the gate began to creak. She let out a little yelp of surprise and looked around frantically for a place to hide, her light brown skin flushing and her hands flapping. She saw old Gramps waving her down, and Auntie Martha dropped, laying among the tomato plants and crushing a few in her haste. Fengi shook his head sadly. Auntie Surfy, who did the family laundry, would not be pleased when she got Martha's skirt and blouse to scrub clean. Auntie Surfy was always getting on Fengi for stains in his silk shirts. But wood is just dirty sometimes. Two of the cousin guards in green woolen uniforms rushed to the slowly opening gates. They had been on the outside of the gates until just a couple of weeks ago, when they were replaced by the men in blue. Oh, the family had been very angry about that, arguing so much at dinner that Fengi covered his ears and left the table to go downstairs to his bedroom. He didn't understand why the cousin guards weren't allowed to guard the mansion on the outside anymore, only that they were mad about being replaced by the army. Fengi was only vaguely aware of who the army was, and he knew that his family didn't like them. And now the men in blue uniforms were making a mistake, letting in a wagon at the wrong time. He watched with old Gramps crouched protectively around him as the cousin guards had loud words with the men in the dark blue uniforms. Still, the wagon came in, with men in simple clothes accompanying it to unload as quickly as possible. One man in a straw hat, pulled down low over his eyes, spoke to the cousin guards, slowly pushing them away from the men in blue uniforms, as if he was trying to make them not angry anymore. Fengi hated it when people were angry. It made his heart thump, and he'd think up of new songs in his head to feel better. Finally, the cousin guards nodded. The man in the straw hat patted one of them on the shoulder, and the other cousin guard pulled out something from his pocket to give to the hat man. He put the folded something into his shirt pocket and headed for the wagon. They were almost finished unloading it and then would go back out to the heavy black back gates, back to where it was dangerous. Fengi felt heaviness in his belly when he thought about that. His mother told him how people suffered and died outside of the stone walls, how lucky they were that the king took such good care of the family. But it wasn't until that moment that Fengi realized something. The people he saw right now, driving the team and unloading the wagon, might not be alive next week. That thought gave him tears, and Fengi sniffled and rubbed his nose on his sleeve. "Hush!" old Gramps whispered. "They can't be allowed to know we're here. We have to stay hidden, remember? It's the only way we can be safe. Be quiet. They'll be going soon." Once they did, and the heavy gates shut again with a deep thunk, the family came out of their hiding places. Auntie Martha shook her head at old Gramps, and he shrugged back at her. A few more of the family had been startled too, and were running back to the mansion. Fengi's mother came out to drag him back to the grand house, and everyone talked in worried voices for a while, until Fengi got bored and went to fill his wood bucket. Fengi had felt like crying ever since for those men in blue uniforms and the ones who delivered the wood. The family had been talking about new dangers and how poorly the men in blue did their jobs. But for the past week, Fengi was worried for them, that they might not survive the war because they were on the wrong side of the stone wall. Today, as he reached the back stone wall, he glanced around before sneaking up to the gate. There was a tiny gap in the layers of wood where he recently discovered that he could spy on the men in blue. Soldiers, he'd heard King Quirrell IV call them. He had been filling wood buckets a few weeks ago and accidentally got too close to where the king was talking with other big men. These soldiers outside the gate stood tall and stiff, and seemed rather bored from what little that Fengi could see. They paced in front of the gate, paused, spun, then paced again. The cousin guards used to play games, Fengi knew, and took lots of naps when the sun got hot. He heard their wives complaining about that. But not these soldiers. They stood and marched and stared. What a dull and dangerous life, Fengi thought sadly. But at least they're not dead. Nervous about being so close to peril, yet feeling quite brave that he'd spent half a song watching the soldiers, Fengi raced back up to the mountain and the massive pile of wood. It must have been newly delivered, having come during the night when it was supposed to arrive. The soldiers were doing a better job now. Fengi's mother was there, heading out to the gardens. "Fengi, start your chore. Where have you been?" "Just running." He couldn't tell her about watching the men in blue. She would be too worried for him. He'd have to forget about soldiers and their dull, dangerous lives. But not thinking about them meant that no one was worrying about them, and he felt that he should worry about them. Fengi positioned the bucket and started loading it with chopped wood. The task would take all day, running from one box by the fireplaces to another, keeping them full. The trick was never to be seen. It was all right if the king saw him. Quarrel the Fourth often patted Fengi's curly black hair, but no one else, besides the cooks and the maids and the gardeners and the milkers and the groomsmen, were to see him. The family had to be safe. Only if no one knew they were hiding in the mansion could they be kept alive. They'd been hiding for many years, and not even the dull men in danger outside the gates knew they were there. Only King Quarrel the Fourth, his mother Queen Jessie, his sons Quarrel the Fifth and Orin, and then the king's wife Margot. Oh, wait, not her anymore. Today was an easy box-filling day because no one else was in the mansion but the family. So Fengi didn't have to slip behind tall curtains, or dart around trees and big pots, or dive under sofas, or scrambled up staircases so no one would see him, which meant it'd also be a dull day for him. So Fengi hummed a little tune. He liked to make up his own music, which his mother said was wonderful, but Auntie Martha in the kitchen said it was useless noise. He filled the first wood box in the gold room, with the polished stone floors and the golden silk drapes. Fengi had undergarments made of the same gold silk, left over from when Auntie Helga made them. He thought it was silly that they made curtains out of underwear. Noisily, he dumped the split logs into the box, aiming carefully to keep the bark from falling outside. Job done perfectly, he rushed back outside to fill his bucket again, tugged playfully on his mother's sleeve, then darted into the officers' reception hall. This room was all blue and silver, with heavy curtains, which also made up his greatest Seraphina's skirts. There were 3 fireplaces here. Fires kept all the bad people away, Quarrel the Fourth told him. If he didn't keep the fireboxes full, even when they didn't need fires for heat or light, the bad men would get everyone in the mansion. Whistling proudly, everyone hated to hear him whistle, so he did it only in the big empty halls where the songs came back to him. Fengi emptied his bucket and rushed out again. He hadn't noticed that in the folds of the heavy drapes there stood a figure of a man whose clothing was nearly the same blue. The figure mumbled to himself, "Who in the world was that?" A minute later, Fengi was back. He dumped another bucketful, spun to head out again. Clonk! Suddenly, Fengi couldn't see anything clearly, noticing only blue and silver as he fell back. "Whoa, whoa, whoa," said a deep but quiet voice. "Careful, son. Didn't expect you to spin around like that. Here, let me help you up. Are you hurt?" "Nah, just clanked a little on the head. I never met a boy who wasn't a little woohoo." Fengi felt strong arms stand him up again, and he held his head, which now ached. He had crashed, that much he knew, but into silver. That's what he saw right in front of him, a long, heavy silver sword. The cousin guards had swords, but not like this one. It was as tall as Fengi, and it was hanging off the belt of a man who, well, Fengi didn't know men could have bellies that big. It was like two men in one pair of trousers. Fangi was in awe. He forgot his pounding head, his dropped bucket, his quiet feeling that maybe this man shouldn't be there, and instead raised his hand and poked his finger into the big belly. He didn't expect it to be so firm. He also didn't expect the man to chuckle quietly, as if Fangi's poke had released thunder from his stomach. Yes, thank you for that. I like to pretend it's muscle, but it's mostly just cheese. Fangi's eyes traveled up to where the belly connected to a chest the size of a horse, then up further to a man taller than he'd ever seen. He had dark brown eyes, black hair closely cut, skin as pale as yellow tinted gravel, and a smooth chin, which was strange because almost every man Fangi knew had shaggy hair like the dogs who stayed with the sheep, and beards that covered half their faces. This man seemed scary, but also not scary, and he was wearing the same blue as the poor soldiers outside. But his blue jacket had all kinds of gold patches and shiny bits of metal on it. Fangi remembered the soldiers also didn't have beards or shaggy hair, and their jackets were not as cluttered with extra things. With a soft grunt, the man went down on one knee to look closer at Fangi. "And who might you be, young man?" His voice was kind and quiet, and Fangi felt safe, although "I'm not supposed to talk to you," Fangi managed, and remembered too late that the kings had always told him to run, run, run if he saw a strange man. He glanced over to the door, and so did the big man. "It's all right, son. You won't get in trouble. You see, I work with the king. A little security check, if you will. Best done when no one knows I'm here. Understand?" Fangi shook his head. The man waved that away. "You don't need to understand. Just tell me, what's your name? Do you work here? Why are you in the mansion?" "It needs wood," Fangi squeaked. "Agreed," the man said, and Fangi realized that there was something smiling in his dark eyes, something like Uncle Wilbur's face that seemed hard but was actually happy under the skin. Fangi found his courage because he was too curious. "Are you like the men by the back gate?" The big man grinned, crinkling his eyes. "Yes, I'm the soldier in charge, you could say. If I tell you my name, will you tell me yours?" Quietly he said, "Fangi." "That's an unusual name. I've never met another little boy with that name." Fangi frowned. "There are no other little boys besides Quirrell the Fifth and Orin, and me." The man tipped his head. "No other little boys. Then he held out his hand. "Pere, that's my name. Shake hands, boy, it's polite. Don't know about shaking hands? This is how you do it. Hey, that's a powerful grip there. Gonna pop my hand off. No, don't look so alarmed. That's just a figure of speech. Never heard it before? Well, you did the handshake properly, sir." With another grunt, Pere pushed off the ground and stood up. He put his hands on his waist and scrunched up his face as he examined Fangi. "Interesting," he said quietly. "Where did you say you live?" "Here." "Really? And how old are you?" Fangi held up fingers on both hands. He couldn't remember what it was called. "Fangi, are you good at keeping secrets?" Pere whispered the last words. He hesitated, unsure. "That means not telling people what you shouldn't," Pere explained. Fangi thought about watching the men on the other side of the gate, and he hadn't said anything about them. "I think so." "Good. Then, Fangi, tell no one that you saw me here. I'm trying to help King Quirrell, and it's like a secret game we play, where I come into the mansion and see how safe it is." Fangi swallowed. "Is it safe?" Pere bobbed his head. "Clearly not, if I've been in here for half an hour, and no one but the wood boy has noticed, but I'm going to fix that." "Clearly not. They weren't safe. But he kept the wood boxes filled every day, and the fires going. What more did he have to do?" Fangi began to tremble. This must mean the danger was coming inside the stone walls. "Pere, the war won't get me, will it? Your soldiers outside, they'll keep the war away from me and the family?" Pere stared down at Fangi. The war? The war. Sure, Fengi. That's my job, to keep the war from you. Fengi wasn't sure because Pere didn't sound sure. He sounded even more confused, and Fengi's tremble turned into full shaking. He thought of the big stone where the garden started. It was for children, old Gramps had told him. The number of children that he had fingers on one hand. They had died in the war, and their bodies had been thrown over the stone wall. The family had dug graves for them. It was a long time ago, and Fengi was too young to help much, but he had little memories of carrying rocks and throwing them into the pit. The children had a stone set above them, with lines carved into it. Quarrel III told them, as he helped put flowers around it, that the lines meant that they would never forget the children who died in the war that was now coming to him, because even though he kept the wood boxes filled, it wasn't enough. Fengi didn't want to be buried in the garden. Suddenly Pere was kneeling down in front of him, gripping Fengi's arms. Son, calm down. Don't cry, you poor thing. You're shaking like a new puppy. Fengi perked up at that. Despite every fear that was coming at him like angry ravens, he couldn't help but feel some happiness because he remembered holding the new puppies a few weeks ago to help get them warm. He cuddled so many that his mother said he was the best puppy warmer ever to be born in the world. He sniffled. I like puppies. Pere began to smile. Do you now? Puppies are good. Very distracting, I see. Don't worry, Fengi. The war will not touch you. I can promise that. Nor will it touch the family. Now, remember to be quiet about me being here. I'm trying to help the king, and I can't have you saying you saw me. It's part of the game, all right? This is how I keep you safe. Like you probably keep the puppies safe, right? Fengi nodded, feeling a lot better by thinking about puppies. Pere patted him on the head like the king did, and dragged a large finger gently down Fengi's nose, ending with a little bounce at the end of it and a boop sound. Now go finish your chores. Nice to meet you, Fengi. You too, Pere. When the sun was at the highest in the sky, Fengi pushed open the door. It was one of many in the hallway in the basement. Some doors were for other families, but this was for his mother and Fengi. But this door led to Great Danny and Greatest Seraphina, seated as usual in their big chair and sofa. They were the very oldest of the family, and rarely ventured out of their room. It was safest here. Great Danny sniffed the air. Is that my Fengi with my midday meal? Sure is, Greats, Fengi said, carefully carrying in the tray. He set the bowls of stew and thick slices of bread on the table between the two grates. Every day he took a break from delivering wood upstairs so that he could deliver food downstairs. Great Danny set aside the ball of yarn he was rolling and gingerly felt around for a spoon, then smiled in the direction of Fengi. Well delivered again, son. Thank you, Fengi said, but there was no energy in his voice. Something bothering you, Fengi? Asked Greatest Seraphina, shredding her bread with her fingers. Having only a few teeth made chewing hard. Sit for a minute with us before you get back to filling the wood boxes. Fengi sat down worriedly on a stool as the Greats began to eat. How safe are we in the mansion, Great Danny? No place safer in the world, he said easily, as he slurped up a small onion. It's true, Greatest Seraphina said. But what about Oren's mother? Fengi asked timidly. She'll be back, just out on a little trip most likely, said Seraphina. Fengi liked that answer, even if it kept falling down in his mind like it couldn't stand up straight. Oren's mother, Margot, was nice to Fengi, sometimes giving him small smiles when Grandmother Jessie wasn't looking. Do the men in blue keep us safe, Greats? Which men in blue? Danny said, patting to find his bread. Fengi took a deep breath before confessing. I saw men in blue, outside the back gates. They have swords and they walk back and forth. Soldiers? Danny scowled. Not sure that I like that, men from the garrison. We used to fight the men in the blue uniforms, Fengi. And remember, the men in the blue uniforms used to defend us, too, Seraphina cut in. That was the problem, Danny grumbled. not knowing which man in blue was defending you or attacking you. Do we know now? Fengi began to tremble again, but neither of the greats could see well enough to notice. Of course we do, Seraphina said brightly. The men in blue keep us safe from the garters in black. Fengi sighed in relief until, wait, who are the garters in black? Haven't you heard of those? Danny continued to slurp his soup. The men who betrayed Quarrel the First, you know this story. No, I don't. Sure you do, about the last guide of the world. He was trying to help the dissenters. That means the bad people who were fighting against our Quarrel the First, Seraphina interrupted to explain the strangely long word. Danny continued without missing a beat. To find a new land to live in, somewhere in the northern mountains. That-a-ways, he gestured to the air, but Seraphina pointed in the correct direction for Fengi's sake. Up near Moorland, that's where they were to go, past that tiny village into the mountains behind it. The first Quarrel sent some of his most trusted guards to go with the guide as protection, because who knows what's out there. If the guide succeeded, we could get rid of all the people who attack and hate us. No one's ever lived beyond our world's borders because all the land is poisoned. Everyone knows that. But the old guide was going to try to give it a try anyway. See if he couldn't find somewhere for the bad people to live. But the guards wouldn't hear of it. If you ask me, those guards were cowards, afraid to leave the borders of the world following some holy man who they said they should trust, and they should trust him. So do you know what they did? Fengi was shaking his head wildly and worriedly, but Danny couldn't see it. Fengi's saying no, he doesn't, Seraphina supplied. Just tell the story, Danny. Fengi had to wait because Danny had taken advantage of the moment to take a bite of his bread. When he finished chewing, he said, Quarrel's guards killed the guide instead, left his body somewhere on the mountain and pretended he died or fell into a pit or somewhere. But Quarrel the First, he was a shrewd man. That means he could figure things out, Seraphina explained again. And Quarrel figured out they had killed the last guide. So Quarrel executed them. Ha! Served them right. Their relatives weren't too happy about that, though. So they've been trying to get back at us ever since. They dress up in black clothes, raid the villages, and sometimes make it into the city of Idumea itself. But we're safe, here in the very middle. No garters can get to us. He went back, chewing his bread, but Fengi was rigid with fear. So in the war, there are now garters and black fighting too? Danny looked up from his stew, hearing the dread in the boy's words. Are you scared, Fengi? I thought you knew all this. Goodness, of course we're fighting the garters and the war. He turned to Seraphina. Who should have been telling him all this? Us, apparently, she said. To her great-great-grandson, she said, We're safe here, Fengi, always have been. Whatever else happens in the world is only in the world, not here in the mansion. So, Fengi, push all worries from your head. But he couldn't because they were so new and terrible and exciting that he had to think about all of them. No, he should know this, Danny said. He may someday be a cousin guard and should be prepared. He's old enough to know everything. No, he's not, Seraphina said so sharply that Fengi jumped a little. But Danny was looking in his direction. Do you want to know, boy? Everything? Fengi nodded nervously. I'll assume by your silence you're saying yes, Danny said. Fengi, the world has been fighting since I was your age, my whole life. Outside the mansion, the city of Idumea and the villages are, well, you know, the chicken coop. That's how the rest of the world lives, in shacks like that. Straw on the floor, thin boards. In fact, I think our chickens actually live better than most of the world because we seal up all the cracks and the roof is weather-tight. But people who live in villages and outside our walls, they wish they had the luxury of our chickens. People fight so much no one has time to build a decent house. Nor can they grow food like us or livestock as we do. They may be safe for a few seasons, then the war moves to them again. Fengi, we're in the very middle of the world in Idumea. That's why it's never reached us. But on the edges and the villages in the north, at the base of where there's this mountain, there's... Fengi waved his hands to stop him, which Danny didn't see. Wait, you've said that word before. Mountains. What are mountains? Danny sighed, trying to think. Give me that blanket on the bed. Fengi handed it over, and Danny propped it up in big lumps, running his hand over it to feel the contours. It's land, but it looks like this, all bumpy and rocky and very high. Impossible to climb and ugly to look at. Very dangerous. Rocks roll down into the villages, and in those mountains live the garters who wear black. But you just said no one can climb the mountains, so how do they... The garters aren't like regular people, Danny said with a snarl of remembrance. They're vicious, like wild animals, and they don't care about anyone but themselves. Remember last year when that big wildcat came over the rock wall? Quirrell the Third called it a mountain lion, remember? Oh, Fengi remembered, and he pulled himself into a ball on the stool. The animal had snarled and screamed and even killed one of the sheepdogs, before the cousin guards filled it with arrows. It had a hurt leg, Fengi remembered. It was scary. That's the garters, Danny told him. Wounded and angry and very, very scary. Villages on the edges of the world have to battle them every year, so sometimes they're fighting the war and the garters at the same time. And the villages by the forests. Garters live in the trees, too, and come out to get children by night. Enough now, Seraphina said sharply. Fengi's shaking like a lamb trimmer. No, it's all right, said Fengi bravely. Go on. Danny continued as if he hadn't been interrupted. It's safer by the water, he said, if you live by coast or waves. Yet still the war continues there between the villagers. They fight for food, for land, for animals. No one knows how to share or be civil, Fengi. No one except in these stone walls. And even we haven't been safe behind these walls. The fighting's reached the city, Fengi. When? He squeaked. Danny shrugged. Many times. The last time was when you were young. You know about the children buried at the edge of the garden, right, where the raspberries begin? Fengi, have you ever noticed that between the berry bushes there are tall rocks? Yes. His voice was even higher. Seraphina was shaking her head, her lips pressed tightly together in silent admonishment, but Danny couldn't see her, so he kept going. Each of those stones marks people who have died, Fengi. You know one of those stones is for your father and your older brother who you never knew. They died from the pox before you were born, but there are many, many other stones, all for victims of the war. It's a lot, Fengi whispered. Yes, it is, Danny sadly agreed. I used to know the number. I can't recall anymore. Much more than all of your fingers and toes, though. Maybe in the 80s? Fengi only blinked, not knowing what 80s meant. But none recently, not for a couple of years, Seraphina insisted. We've been safer, and I think it's because of the men in the blue uniforms are now fighting for us. I bet they're sad, Fengi whispered. The people of the world, because they have sad lives and sad houses. We have lots of space, he suddenly realized. We could let some of them live here. Grandmother Jessie has the whole top floor to herself. She doesn't need so many rooms. Let's invite some people to live with us, the nice ones only. Seraphina sighed. What a child, what a heart. Oh, Fengi, how do you know who's nice? That's the problem. Just like Great Danny told you, Quirrell the First thought he could trust his guards to take care of Guide Pax. He thought they were nice, but they killed Pax instead. So Quirrell had to kill those guards, and their families are still mad about it. They still want to hurt us, especially those of us in the mansion. It's so hard, Fengi, to trust anyone outside of the family. In fact, we can't. Not even the men in the blue uniforms at the gates? Seraphina thought about that. I want to, Fengi, I want to, but how can we ever be sure? Trust no one, Fengi, Danny said decisively. Be your nice, sweet self, but trust no one else. The High General of the Army of Idumea lumbered through the garrison that afternoon like an agitated bear with a bee sting. For a man who was usually talkative and genial, he was unusually curt and gruff. The chief of law enforcement for the city of Idumea had strolled in easily for their scheduled meeting, then came rushing out 3 minutes later in a high general-induced panic, calling for his men to collect up all of the missing persons files, not just what they had brought in. By dinner time, the garrison was breathing easier because the high general, grumbling under his breath, was finally on his way home. Now they could natter like grandmothers about what change had overcome him. They had never, during his 20 years of service, seen him so upset. And every soldier worried for the High General's wife and son. A child! Where in the world did he get a child? He has two himself, his wife calmly replied. His son Quirrell the Fifth and Orin, remember? Quirrell's probably 12 and Orin's maybe 7 years old now. This little boy was not Orin, the massive man in the black uniform whispered harshly, trying to keep his voice down. Orin is pale and stringy and sickly. This little boy, Fangy, had skin like brown soil, with black curly hair and was very healthy. Pere Shin paced in his gathering room, while his wife Banu sat on the sofa, holding her stitching protectively to her chest. Pere paused at the stairs and glanced up them to make sure his 14-year-old son wasn't within earshot. Ralph was up in his bedroom, where he couldn't be listening in on army secrets. Not yet, at least. But this doesn't make sense, Banu murmured. Why is there another boy there? How old was he? Maybe 8, Pere said, punching one hand into another, a new tactic for him. He'd been appointed to his new position partly because he was the most amiable officer in the army of Idumea. He didn't know how to do annoyed effectively yet. His palm was growing red and sore. He didn't know his age, Pere continued, but he held up 7, then 8 fingers. He seems to be a laborer filling up the wood buckets, but strangely with very nice clothing. A fine linen shirt dyed dark green, and worsted wool trousers of the same quality as my dress uniform. Doesn't make sense. No one's missing a child in the area. I checked with the law enforcers. That was another thing he hadn't quite figured out yet. How to be commanding without outright scaring people. The poor chief of enforcement had gone as pale as cheese when Pere bellowed at him about the scanty missing persons report. It had been the first time during the 5 years that Pere had been in Idumea that anyone had heard him angry. He was rather surprised himself that he could get so worked up. And he said he lived there, Banu. I'm beginning to have an idea as to why your friend couldn't get a job as a maid in the mansion. His wife looked at him blankly. Because they don't have any openings? Pere paused in his pacing and glanced at his wife. While not nearly as tall as him, she was close to the same size and girth. Her honey-brown hair was pulled up in a bun, and her skin tone was more gravel-colored than his yellow sulphur-tinted like his. She was a kind, sweet woman, generous and concerned, all around a lovely, rich lump of butter, which also happened to be the same ingredient to nearly every fantastic dish she created. But she tended to be a little slow at times. Right now, she was molasses in the coldest moons of raining season. Still, he adored her, and molasses. No, he said patiently, and yes, in a way. What I'm thinking is, well, ridiculous. However, it's knocking at the back of my head. You've seen Quirrell the Fourth a few times, Banu. What's his most distinctive feature? Banu frowned and thought. He's not the most attractive man, but he's not entirely ugly. Pere stopped again in his pacing and waited. She'd get there in a minute. Maybe he should keep pacing, since the garrison surgeon told him he needed to lose a few pounds to legally still be in the army, a small fact they'd overlooked for the past dozen years or so. But he was now supposed to set the example. Although Pere always figured out that the bigger he was, the easier he was for his men to see. I always thought his ears were all right, Banu continued thoughtfully. His eyes are not very interesting, but at least there's 2. His mouth is, well, a mouth. Pere pinched the bridge of his nose, hoping it might give her a clue. And his nose, well, it's kind of odd. It has a bump in the middle, and then like a little fleshy ball at the end with kind of a line down the middle. Now that you mention it, she said, suddenly eager, it's a rather distinctive nose. I didn't mention it, he said pleasantly to her. You are mentioning it, and if you remember his nose, so will everyone else. Banu, that little boy had the same nose. Banu blinked. Are you sure? Didn't Quirrell's father have the same nose, too? Yes, Pere said heavily, and dropped his bulk on the sofa next to her. That's kind of weird, isn't it? She mused, setting aside her stitching. That a laborer boy would have the same distinctive nose? What kind of a coincidence is that? Pere patted her leg. It's not a coincidence at all, I'm afraid. The boy said something about the family. What does that mean? It means I need to do some more investigating. How did you get into the mansion anyway? She asked. Pere smirked proudly. I have a few sneaking skills that I learned back when I was in command school. Had to make sure I could get back into the dorms late at night when my girlfriend had kept me out too long. He elbowed her. That was never my fault, she insisted. It was always yours. She smiled that his good humor was returning. I'll admit it was my fault, he said nobly. You always cooked me so much I'd feel ashamed if I let any of it go to waste. Instead, I'd let it go to my waste. But I still have my talent, he said smugly, and I bet that if we still had our family lines, they'd reveal that a few generations back I had garter blood in me. Well, he exhaled, suddenly uncomfortable at that stray thought. It's probably a good thing all those records were lost in that fire. Can't have anyone in the army related to any of its enemies, at least not knowingly. But it really wasn't difficult to get into the mansion, he continued. I had the soldiers outside a rarely used side gate let me in, but I explained it was a security check and they shouldn't let anyone know. New procedures, I told them. I found the land inside quite developed, with lots of berry bushes filling the area between the mansion and the stone wall. You know, only the front of the mansion has windows. The rest of its walls merely have slits as openings. Of course, it was built by Quirrell the First during the Great War, so if you have small windows, it's harder to shoot arrows in. But it does leave just enough room to shoot arrows out. So I had the advantage. No one saw me lurking around the shrubs. Banu, I'd forgotten how big that place is. The kings only ever let guests into the front 5 or 6 rooms, but the mansion goes back at least for 50 paces. Then again, it's only been on rare occasions that the army is ever allowed near the mansion. Actually, no one's ever allowed near it, except for suppliers who go in that much larger gate on the other side. And even then, the Quirrells let them only in after dark. Why? Banu asked. Pere sighed. No idea. It's a very secretive bunch that lives there. I don't like it. The Quirrells have never wanted anyone to know who's there. Even the delivery men just drop off their goods at the back barn and don't see another person before they leave. I've spoken to a few of them. You know, he said, his tone becoming pensive, that mansion is big enough for... He paused and thought. Well, it's 3 levels high. I can't imagine what's up there. Likely quarters for the family, with probably that entire 3rd floor for that horrid grandmother. Banu shuddered at the reference. Queen Jessie had rudely snubbed Banu at Pere's installation dinner 3 weeks ago, refusing to speak to her, and on more than one occasion made quiet snorting noises in her direction. But sweet Banu hadn't even noticed. She was too traumatized to realize that there was only one kind of jam served with the biscuits, and it was plum of all things, and only one dessert option presented at the dinner. Any mention of Jessie after that dinner put Banu into shaking fits. Anyway, I found a narrow wooden door on the side of the mansion between those 2 rose bushes. It led over to a rather nice privy, just to the side of the mansion, an 8-holer with interior walls. Wait, Banu interrupted, already over her terror of stingy Queen Jessie. Doesn't that mansion have indoor washrooms now? I would have thought the Quirrells would have been the first to pay for the piping under the mansion. While I'm sure Quirrell would love to relieve himself in the comfort and style of his home, there's a problem, he interrupted her back. The rest of us have cellars and houses of reasonable size, he said, glancing around their home. It was certainly larger than the average home, but also not on the scale of a mansion. But the king's mansion, that has polished stone floors throughout the main floor. One can hardly cut into that to lay pipe for waste removal, or even to pump in warm water from the springs. Besides, his voice grew agitated, a work crew would have to be allowed into the grounds and into the mansion, and Quirrell has never let that happen. Poor people, Banu said sadly, still having to relieve themselves outside or in chamber pots. Pere tapped his hand on the armrest of the sofa. He spoke to his wife mostly to organize his thoughts, not to listen to her commentary. Yet Banu was, well, there was a deep sweetness that Pere would never understand, and it was her compassion for others in any situation that always astonished him, even if he were talking about the king of the world, that cowardly idiot. Anyway, Pere continued, I slipped into the wooden side door on the eastern side of the mansion. It was unguarded. I guess they don't think they need to keep the privy door guarded, but that's precisely the kind of door that does need guarding. So I found myself in the tightest of passages. Maybe only tight for you, she commented. You really don't want to hear about the amazingly delicious secrets of the mansion, do you? I'm about to tell you things no one else in the world knows, and you'd rather insult my love of your cooking. Is that it? She giggled. Of course not. Think of how much I could tell my friends. About nothing. Banu, my dearest, your incredible, handsome, and charming husband now has the most important job in the army, and you can't tell anyone anything. Is that true? She nearly wailed. That I'm incredible, handsome, and charming? Why, yes, it is. How else do you think I got the position? Because all of the other officers can't stand the Quirrells and didn't want to work with them. That's what you told me. And that's true as well, he sighed in resignation. She nudged him. I promise I'll keep quiet. So, what did you find through the little door? Ah, interested again, are you? I went down a couple of stairs and found myself in the basement of the mansion. But the mansion doesn't have a basement, only a foundation. That's what I thought, but yes, it does, running the full length. It's an entire unknown floor. I was in a hallway that extended to either end of the mansion, and it was quite wide and tall. Yes, even big enough for me. I beat you to that one. I waited a few minutes to let my eyes adjust to the dark. There were a few candles and sconces on the wall, but it was still dim, even though it was a bright morning outside. I also listened for noises. There were some. Voices, softly, from one of the dozens of doors down the hall. I crept along and saw a door cracked open. The room had light coming from a narrow, horizontal crack of a window near the ceiling. And in that room were potatoes, Banu guessed. Dearest, Pere patted the sofa armrest again. May I please just tell the story? But potatoes are stored in a dark basement so they don't rot. Yes, and I did find large rooms full of potatoes and onions and barrels of who knows what. Yes, half the basement was storage, but Banu, here's the important thing, and no, they weren't talking potatoes. I saw two very old people in that room, one sitting in a cushioned chair and another reclining on a battered old sofa. Old people? That's not a very nice way to keep old people in a basement. Well, keeps them from rotting, I suppose, like potatoes. I mean, they look like two lumpy bags. That's not nice, Pere. Then let me finish the story. She folded her arms. One of them was a man, and as far as I could tell, he was blind. He was rolling up yarn and not looking at his work, but feeling it. He was so tiny and wrinkled. Must have been close to 90 if I had a guess. And talking with him was a woman, just as ancient, knitting. Sounded like she was reciting some story or poetry I couldn't quite hear. But Banu, What's Quirrell doing with 2 old people in his basement? I don't know, she whispered, very concerned. But they certainly would have appreciated an indoor washroom. Pere had to smile. Indeed, but the piping would have to go through their quarters, which no one outside of the mansion knows exists but me, and now you, but you've promised not to tell. Banu frowned at that, and then remembered something. What about that boy? How did you find him? Pere held up a finger. Ah, that is interesting. After I poked around the basement for about half an hour, no one came down, and I think the ancients in the room were a bit hard of hearing. I found a dark stairwell. Not the regular kind, big and wide at either end of the hallway, but a narrow one. And I'm fairly certain I found 2 more, but I didn't have a chance to explore them. Secret passages, as far as I could tell. I went up the stairs of the first one I found. It angled as if going around other rooms or features in the mansion, and I opened the first door I came to. I found myself facing the long length of silk, of dark blue silk. Banu leaned forward. Like in the officer's reception room? Exactly like the officer's reception room. That's because I love that silk. When we were there for your installation dinner, Mrs. Humphrey and I fingered the silk and tried to figure out how much it cost. Banu, what I'm trying to tell you is that the secret staircase deposited me directly in the officer's reception room, the same room. I slipped out from behind the curtain in time to see my little friend dump his wood bucket and dart out again. Realizing there were 3 fireplaces and that he'd have to come back, I positioned myself next to another curtain panel. You know, there are no windows in that room. Anyway, the little guy came barreling in there, and just as I stepped out, he turned and smacked right into my sword. Clanked his head, I'm sorry to report, but all little boys have to have some amount of brain damage, otherwise they aren't real boys. And that's how I met him. How unusual, Banu breathed. Really no windows. Banu, the unusual part is that the boy even exists. Well, we talked about that already, but I think it's strange that they spend gold on windows that aren't even there. Pere sat back. The other reason why he told his wife everything was because she was often accidentally insightful. You're right. Why create the illusion of windows, and at that expense? How were the old people dressed, the ones in the basement? Pere paused. Quite nicely, now that I think about it. The sofa was tattered, but the surroundings were rather comfortable. Maybe Quirrell took in an old couple. How kind of him. Banu, Pere began slowly, when in the history of the 4 Quirrell kings have we ever seen them do something kind? This could be a first, she insisted, although it would have been kind of them to give my friend a job, because if they can afford silk curtains for windows that don't exist, they certainly have enough gold. How many servants do they employ to keep up that massive mansion? Pere rocked back. Employed servants. Huh. I need to get back in there. How did you get out? His wife asked. Same way I got in, although I heard other voices and I was intrigued. I felt like I'd pressed my luck as far as I dared. No one saw me either. There were laborers in the field. Talk about fields, Banu. That rock wall of Quirrell's, I knew it extended all the way around, probably 20 acres worth, but I didn't realize what he had in that yard. Kind of hard to see over a wall that's 12 feet high, especially when Quirrell I declared that no one is ever allowed to build anything taller than the mansion. But they have everything back there, as far as I could tell. Extensive vegetable gardens, berries, grapevines, short fruit trees. He can grow everything he needs, and probably for 100 people. From the sounds in the distance, it also seems he keeps chickens and pigs, and there was even a pasture where I spotted a few cows. Most cows are spotted, Banu agreed, especially milk ones. Pere let that one go. It's an entire farm, Banu, with at least a dozen laborers. But employment records. Excellent idea. I'm wondering if that little boy is working there without pay. It'd be like Quirrell to make a child work while his parents are in the fields. When he should be in school, Banu said, picking up her stitching. Wait, what? The break for weeding season was over last week. Don't you remember your son complaining about having to go back to school today? And that boy you found seemingly couldn't count if he's only holding up fingers. Pere smiled in appreciation at his wife and planted a big kiss on her lips. I know there's a reason why I keep you around. She blushed. Because no one else can feed you so well? His smile faded. But I didn't tell you the worst part. That little boy, Fangy, he thinks the war is still going on. Banu dropped her stitching. The Great War? But that ended in 200. Pere sighed in relief that she got the year correct for once. The wife of the High General should know when the last major conflict ended. I need to get back into that mansion and talk to my new little friend. I promised him I'd keep him safe, and I better prove that I'm good to my word. Thank you. That's the end of the first chapter.